Welcome to Drum Addicts on Andertons TV, and today we're talking about V-drums, and I've stolen basically Roland UK and Roland Europe. So we've got Jules from Europe and John from the UK, and we're just going to talk about drums. Me and Jules are both very geeky and have played V-drums for ages, so we've been planning this for a little while. So hopefully you're just going to learn about some gear and why it's so good. So let's talk V-drums.
Okay.
How did Roland start drums? Obviously they're very famous for V-drums now, but they actually started sort of drum triggers and drum machines as well. So let's talk about the early days.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Roland's kind of known, for doing all kinds of products, like a lot of keys, a lot of synthesizers, pianos, products like that. But actually, some of our first products were drum machines. But drum machines back then in the early 70s, so 1972, we came out with products like the TR-33, TR-55, TR-77, and they were kind of rhythm composers. They were in wooden cabinets and they were designed to sit on top of like organs that you'd have in your home. So the whole idea is that you could program beats to play along with your like home organ, your home piano, whatever, and have some accompaniment with that basically. They weren't really designed to be drum machines per se, but that's where we started out. So some of our first products at Roland were actually drum products really.
And what's that, 72, 73, something like that?
72 for those products. And then we brought out more further down the line. So things like the CR78, we're well known for that. That was in the late 70s, I think about 78. TR808, 1980, TR909, 1983.
Which are still famous now.
Yeah, absolutely, for their sounds. And those were programmable drum machines, again, all designed to be accompaniment. But now the kind of music world had moved on, rather than just kind of it being about having accompaniment in your home to play an organ with. These were beats that were part of the music, they were part of the sound of the music, and people were using them for a whole new genres of music.
They sort of pioneered, didn't they? So that was part of it. The people were taking things that necessarily shouldn't be that and then editing them to be a whole genre of music. So
that's right, absolutely.
One of the first times the instrument has rather than someone picking the instrument up and playing music, it was the instrument had converted to say this is what you can do with it. So
that's right. And those products, ironically, in the early 80s, they weren't huge hits for us at that time. It's kind of later on they became really big hits, things like the 808 and the 909, and when they kind of powered the sound of things like the acid house generation, a lot of hip hop, a lot of house music and stuff, that's when they started to become really legendary instruments, ironically, for those. And then
they're still in use now. That is going back to this whole video, literally 20 years of drums for V-drums, but Roland drums have been used for decades, so and still are used in hip hop and sort of grime and things like that. So it's from your proper old school square box with coloured keys, really retro. We'll put a picture in, proper retro, like actual antiques now. Pioneered a whole sound and was starting the journey towards this. So,
well, the first time that we started to make a kit that was in like drum kit form for drummers basically was when we had the Alpha Drum kit, which was in 1985. So very futuristic looking, had a drum module at the time. It was MIDI compatible, and the pads were kind of triangular. I think they were called the PD10 and PD20 at the time. Really futuristic looking thing, but this was a kit that was kind of there to rival things like the Simmons, for example, but you could now sit down, play a drum kit, but it would be electronic. So that was the first kit we made in that form.
And that's also when you get someone who's maybe of an older generation or is a strict acoustic player, in their head that's what they think electronic drums are. Yeah. Still now, we get people come in the store and go, oh, is it triangular or hexagonal pads? It's like, no, that was decades ago. So
I've been really lucky to have a conversation with a few drummers that were big players, and professionally in the 80s, when things like those kind of drum kits, the Simmons and stuff, were really prevalent. And there was a risk at one time, or there was a feeling from those guys that maybe this was going to be the future of drumming, and that we were going to take away their lovely acoustic drums and heads and bronze cymbals and everything that we know as drummers, and replace it with this kind of like MDF feeling pads and synthesized sounds. And that was a real thing at that time, because that's where music was. And then towards the end of the 80s there was quite a big move away from that. It actually went back to more kind of acoustic music, grunge music, all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's funny actually, one of my old teachers was huge in the 80s and played for massive artists. He actually got really bad injuries from playing those kits. Yeah. So horrible RSI. The worst thing was his ankles, just from having terrible foldbacks, not having in-ears, trying to get a sound on stage, just destroying the bass drum, burying it, and just like hideous ankle problems now. So he actually foam his pedal board. He has to put a soft foam on it, so it doesn't have the like the kinetic energy going through the pedal, going up the vibrations up his knee and things. So even like these don't damage you anymore. With the mesh away. And everything, it's even Playability has moved forward, hasn't it? So we'll grow and talk about that. But
we'll definitely talk about the mesh head and when that came about, because that's a really interesting story. But
so first sort of kit that led onto this. So we're the first TD or range of kits.
Yeah, it was the TD7 in 1992, and that's when we had products like the KD7, the kick unit, as part of, here we go, wow, a TD7 module from that era. In fact, the KD7 is the kick unit that's on this very kit that you see here.
And then it had these pads, didn't it? Everywhere, though.
It did. There was the PD7s and PD9s, but they were used for everything. Hi-hats, cymbals, tom, snare, you name it. The only part that we still make of this kit, well, from the TD7 era, is the KD7, still made today. Bulletproof, legendary. They're loved by artists that use them on the stage for second kick drum triggers and
or
things
Thomas
like that.
Lang with 10 of them.
Thomas Lang with 10 of them, yeah, absolutely. Even though we've got products like the KT10 out now, for example, some people still really prefer the KT7, and it's still a demand for it.
As you can tell by that, shall we say vintage, aged one, that one there is 20 years old. It's slightly greener than it once was. It still works.
Exactly, bulletproof.
And I dread to think how many times that's been hit, but it still works. And you can still daisy chain them together. Do you know what I mean? It is still exactly the same product as it is now.
Yeah, I have some artists I know that absolutely swear by them. Yeah, for sure.
So talking about this bass drum being 20 years old, this whole kit, and we're going to show you how it's developed and everything. This is a TD10. So this is where we jumped with the TD range. This is the first V drums, isn't it? So
that's right.
Why was this called? Why did Roland make? Because even now we get people coming to the store and go, oh, I want a V drum, and they think all electronic drums are called V drums. It's like a Hoover's been called a Dyson. It's literally you've switched that. So why is this called a V drum? Why did Roland do that?
Well, there was a big jump between what we've got here, which was 92, the TD7, and the TD10 module that we've got on this kit. Basically, sounds before V drums were synthesized, complete synthesis, basically.
So that whole module is just full of electronic
absolutely
sounds.
It's got waveforms inside, and those waveforms, those sounds, are generated by synthesis, basically. And the difference between something in the 80s compared to something like this was a big step forward. But where we got to with V drums is V means virtual in V drums. We're moving away from complete synthesis to virtual drums. The whole concept of that is, if you could do something in the acoustic world with an acoustic drum kit, you want to be able to do that in a virtual world as well, hence V drums. So the difference between them is that V drums starts out as real acoustic samples, and I'll go on record as saying that our sounds in Roland definitely start out as real acoustic samples for sure. And obviously we record, in the sampling we record lots of different velocity layers of that instrument, so that you get the lightest hit to the heaviest hit across the range of that acoustic drum or cymbal. And you've got that inside the TD10, but the virtual element comes to it in the fact that you can take that stock sound and you can change parts of it just like you would with an acoustic drum. So let's take an acoustic snare, for example. I might want to change the head on the drum, which would affect the sound. The shell material might change the sound, or on a kick drum I might change the beta, for example, and that would completely change the sound. The changes that you make are subtle, but they're important to us as drummers because they really affect the sound that we want for that kit. And that's what you can do with V drums. 1997, the first V drums kit, you could take the acoustic sampled sound and you could apply a technology called COSM, Composite Object Sound Modelling. It sounds complicated, but actually all that means is that it's an algorithm that can physically represent material changes. So if you change a material with a physical object, it will affect the sound. That's what we do with acoustic drums, and that's what it can do here. So you can apply COSM, to the original wave sound inside, the multi-layered, multi-velocity sampled sound, and change it for real inside the TD10. And that's why V-drums and the TD10 particularly was really exciting. It was a massive move forward.
Well, this was obviously, it looks fairly similar to the modern Flagship now, but this really was a jump forward, wasn't it? It was going from things that didn't feel very good, didn't sound very good, and were crazy expensive, to something that is mass produced. More people can play it. It's more accessible to more drummers. You can play in more times of the day because it's quieter, and it really, for many reasons, it was a step forward. So talking about the sort of how you can change things, on the module you can change whether you're in a cave or a studio, things like that. Even then, 20 years ago, started doing that so people can tailor their kit to their sound, how they feel. So you can change the tension of the pads, but then you can electronically change what's happening to the data in the pad. So it really was someone tailoring, it made drumming accessible. So it was cool that this, even 2 decades ago, is doing some of the technology that are in the modern Rolands now.
Absolutely, this stuff was groundbreaking, and that kind of paved the way really for the future stuff. And you know, the stuff you talk about there with the ambience, that's still COSM working, because even in an ambient environment where you've got a room, it's a particular size, that room might be made of different materials, wooden walls, concrete walls, whatever. You can model all of that inside the TD10 or inside V-drums. So you can change the ambient environment as well as changing the physical instrument itself, and you've got ultimate control as drummers. Again, it's that concept. If you can do it in the physical world, let's do it in the virtual world to have that control.
The other cool thing with the TD10 is obviously because it was a physical real kit, you used your wealth of artists as well as your R&D, didn't you? So I remember like Thomas Lang playing this literally in the early 2000s, and it was the artists were pushing the gear as well. So because Roland are who they are, they've got loads of great artists now, but you developed with your artists as well, didn't you? So
absolutely,
and still do now.
Absolutely, real R&D. When you're making a product, you need to take feedback from real people that play the gear. Of course, artists use it professionally, and the artists give it a hard time. You know, both on stage and through touring. You know, literally from transporting it from place to place. It's a real good way of testing equipment, but you can't do that until the product's there and ready. So we put that in the hands of the artists, they use it, they play it, and they feed back to us and they tell us what they need, further ways to enhance it, develop it, etc. And that's the R&D cycle. But we don't just focus on artists, we also talk with real, everyday end users as well, and we hear their feedback as well, and we also build that into R&D. Yeah. And
talking about moving it and playing it, this kit you'll see little like green gaffer tape marks, what pad they are, what height they go. This was literally a gigging rig, so fits in a set of cases that were designed for it and has been played for a couple of decades. So apart from the sort of Heath Robinson cable strapping and labelling, because in the old days they weren't hidden in the rack, so you had to sort of customise it a little bit and get some cable tidy basically and sort your rig out basically. So let's move on from this kit. So this was how you bought it 20 years ago, and these days you'll get your TD50, 30, whatever kit that you play, even 11, even TD1, you can get firmware updates, and you literally just, your iPod, your laptop, even your phone, it's so easy.
Yep.
Let's talk about it 20 years ago. So one of the first upgrades for this, in 99, is it? Bass drum?
Good question. Was it 1999? I thought it was 2000.
It might be 2000.
The TDW1 came out, but
so
yeah.
You basically, you bought your lovely drum kit and you upgraded the actual physical hardware. Now this, to most people, is the bass drum off the TD30.
That's right, 1998. So 1 year after we launched this, in 97, in 1998 we launched this, the V-Kick, and this is the KD120, which we still make today.
And is mesh, so feels nice. And you've got double kick playability, so obviously as cool as that one is and as robust as it is, only ever single.
Yeah.
So this you can have two bass drum beaters on. So, and this is still a product you still make.
Absolutely.
Not in white. So white is vintage, or cream in this case.
Absolutely.
So that was one of the first upgrades. Then this?
The TDW1, yeah, this is the expansion pack.
You don't get these anymore. They're called cardboard boxes. Everything's downloaded now, but literally this had a little chip in it, basically, that you had to put in the module, didn't you? You had to take it a little slot out the back and put this in, and this is how you expanded more sounds, and you actually got more kits, didn't you, on that? So
that's right, more kits, more sounds, and it was also about compatibility as well for using with V cymbals.
Yeah,
which came out in 2001.
And
so
this is a premium 20-year-old. Well, not quite 20, 2001. So.
You know, in the acoustic world, people pay for like pre-aged cymbals. I wonder if this is added value to it.
This was once white, isn't so much anymore.
Cream colour now.
This is I've done loads of gigs, but this lived in a conservatory for a little while, so that's also sunlight does it. But as you can see, green graphite mark. This was perfectly playable ride, and it had
the move away from these, from the PD7 pads used as hi-hats, crushes, etc., into something that looked like a cymbal, but also the way it moves. It was about the physical movement. So a cymbal that will swing as you play.
And also, this had two inputs, didn't it?
Yes.
So this was the first to have bell, bow, edge, and choke.
Absolutely.
So things that we take for granted now, that was another revolution.
The V hi-hat as well.
V hi-hat. Now, John, you hadn't actually seen this before, had you?
That's the first time I saw it today.
So in the old days when hi-hats didn't go up and down electronically, this was very yellow. This was the hi-hat pad. So when I was sort of early 2000s at Drum Alive, when we were saying Thomas Lang was playing, he was using one of these right there, sorted. This still works, a little bit aged. Even still got like the ripples in like real cymbals. Yeah. But that went with your FD7.
Yes. And
was an actual up and down hi-hat that feels a lot better than that. These, John's going to play this in a minute. You'll hear how loud they are and just how they don't feel great, do they?
They don't feel the greatest.
But these were the move forward from just chunky pads, basically, which were a step forward because they're not solid. They weren't, compared to the Simmons, which actually is MDF with some rubber on. Yeah. These are squidgy and a bit more playable. But then the V cymbals, you can see, it's actually like squidgy, and then we move on to that one, which we'll come to in a minute. It wobbles again a different way and is the next step forward. So we had V cymbals, but we had mesh pads. Now that was a big step because you collaborated with Remo, didn't you? So let's talk about that a bit. Obviously, to most people, these pads look exactly the same. Apart from John noticed they've got the old school bar across rather than like the spider webs underneath.
Yeah.
Let's discuss the mesh. I mean, the mesh was playability wise a complete revolution, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, when we made the PD7 and PD9 pads back in the early 90s, they were the best playing feel that you could have at that time for triggering. But one of our mechanical designers in Japan, who still is on our team today, Mr. Yoshino, he's a kind of legendary guy. He's Mr. Meshhead, and he wanted to come up with an idea for a better drum pad that kind of looked more like an acoustic drum, but also was quieter than the PD8 pads and had better feel as well. He kind of took inspiration a little bit from trampolines, because when you are obviously jumping up and down on a trampoline, it's quiet and the material is expanding, etc. And he took that inspiration for creating the mesh head. And his goals were to make something that again looked like a drum, so it could be white, and had the appearance of an acoustic drum head, was quiet, and also tension adjustable. That's really important for the drummer. And so he went about kind of making various prototypes, etc. And in the end, we needed the expertise of Remo because they had the tooling for making the heads, etc. We needed their expertise to help us with the manufacturing process. So that was the collaboration that we had with Remo back in 1996, which led to the V-Pad, which came out with the TD10 kit in 1997.
And still are made by Remo somewhere. If we look at them, they say made by Remo on, and John didn't turn the logo, so this was even, so that one will come up on there. So yeah, and moving forward now, obviously Remo still make the power ply and everything. That partnership is still rolling and is still part of Roland's brand and history. So
interestingly as well, with the power ply head, that's a 2-ply mesh head, which is exactly the same as the original V-Drums head. The only thing that has changed is the logos. There is literally nothing different about that head at all. The reason we called it power ply is because you can use it as an acoustic replacement head for your not an acoustic replacement head. You can use it as a replacement head for your V-Drums, or you can use it to put it on your acoustic drums to make them quiet. But with our heads particularly, because they're 2-ply, they're good if you want to put a trigger on the top. So if you want to put an RT30 series trigger on the top of that and trigger the mesh head into a module, they work very well for that. There are other mesh heads available on the market which are 1-ply only, and the problem with that is you get more deformation in the head. And when you get that deformation, it's not good for accurate triggering, whereas 2-plies just provides a bit more resistance basically, and less deformation, so much more consistent for triggering, which is why we have the original patent for the 2-ply mesh head, and which is why all of our heads, apart from the one on the new digital snare, which
we'll get to,
are 2-ply. Yeah.
And being twin ply, they're very durable. So if you imagine this bass drum, you're hitting it in exactly the same spot every time because the beta is the same diameter and hitting it in exactly the same place. What is really cool is if you are a heavy hitter and you wear through one of your plies and you're not too particular in the logo not being at the top, you can just turn this 90 degrees. So that is a top tip, because then that makes the ply on the outside, which has got a little tear or split, to the left, and you just carry on playing. So they're super durable.
Some people always ask me why we supply beaters with our mesh head.
Let's clear this up, because I tell every customer that buys it in store and anyone that talks to me on the phone why they do this. So let's talk that.
Well, basically, if you use a felt beater on a mesh material, the mesh is slightly abrasive to the felt, so the two rub against each other. First of all, that mesh wears away the felt very quickly, so you end up with lots of felt dust around your kick drum pedal. But secondly, it creates heat through friction, and that can melt a hole in the mesh head over time. But ultimately, it's fine. You can just replace the mesh head fairly inexpensively, but it's an inconvenience for sure. Whereas there's no advantage to using a felt beater with a mesh head. It doesn't really affect the feel at all. Definitely doesn't affect the triggering or the sound. So that's why we supply nylon beaters, because they don't wear a hole in the mesh head.
Top tip again, and that is a rubber pad. Before anyone comments and goes, "Oh, you're using a felt beater," that's because that's rubber.
That's it.
So they're very durable, but you can adjust the tension. They look like real drums. This was another step forward, wasn't it? This was, and John's going to play in a minute, and this kit isn't his and isn't sort of tailored to his playing, and even you went, oh wow, this pad's really slack and that one's really tight, so you can literally change it for different things. And I think the reason that one over there is really tight was because I was doing a timbali thing on it, so that one over there was really tight. But yeah, literally you can change the name and sounds to your set list, and then you can change the feel and actual playability to what you want. Every drum is different. So
there's a couple of things you touched on there which is really important to our V drums basically. I think when people talk about electronic drums, they talk a lot about sound, and everyone invests very heavily into sound. Even things like sample libraries that you get these days and sample packs, the sound is always the focus. What is also just as important as the sound is the playability. So we focus a lot on that, and obviously that's where things like the mesh heads come into it, to get the real feel, the swinging motion of the V cymbals, etc. So having something which looks and feels right as a drummer, but it's also about the sensing technology inside and how accurate it picks up your information as a drummer, because you could have chops like Gad, but unless those pads can pick up what you're playing, where you're playing, how hard you're playing, etc., and send that information to the module, then it's kind of wasted. And then the other point is durability. let's be honest, with drums, they're things that you hit with pieces of wood repeatedly very hard for long periods of time. There's not many other instruments in the world that you need to be able to do that with. Of course, with acoustic drums, we replace heads, we'll crack cymbals. These products, there's stuff that we were making in 1997 that is still going, that used to loan 20 years later. So that kind of stands up to how durable our products need to be, basically, to withstand what drummers will do to them. So we build all of that into V-drums. It's not just about the sound, it's not just about the technology or the COSM, or it's not just about the mesh heads, it's the combination of all those things that really make V-drums what V-drums are.
Yeah, and this kit genuinely is a 1997 like old school 2-decade A1, and the only problem that's ever happened with it was user error and my fault. I don't know, it might have been bass player's fault. All the cables on all the drums and all the cymbals are the original ones, apart from the snare. So a hi-hat stand fell over once, cut this in half. I think it ripped like the copper bit out of that. That's the only thing that's ever gone wrong with this kit. Apart from changing the battery in the module, which is super easy. Don't get confused by the little error message. I haven't done anything to this. Obviously, I've upgraded it. I have polished it every now and again. But literally, this is 20 years old and is still working. And as John will do in a minute, you can whack them. It's still doing its primary task 2 decades later, which is to be hit with pieces of wood, like you said. So if you're investing in your drums, these are good ones to buy. So talking about that, let's hand over to John. Do you want to play us a few kits, twiddle through the classic setup? Because we're going to show you 2 more modules. They all have relatively same big knob there, 3 little knobs here, and the development of the module, if you were to look at them, is very easy transition. So John's going to do some playing. You're also going to tell us about different features, aren't you? So let's talk about like how sensitive they are and how you can do that. You can even change it even on this 2 decades ago. So fire away.
Right. So I've chosen a kit called Top. I really like the sound of the toms on this one. So we'll see how it goes.
They got retro names as well.
Oh yeah.
You can edit that because I've done it for like set lists where it's like song 1 or song 2 and things like that. So you can, even then. So these pads are quite loud, aren't they? And you can see John hit them and his hand just absorbed all the vibration. There was no giving it. So with the power of like Blue Peter, so we take off this very dull, boring pad. You don't get rid of it because you can have like octabands and things like that, which everyone wants. You put this magical little device on, which is called
CYM10.
And you can buy them anywhere you like because they're like add-on products that you screw on, and then you can take, I won't take a ride, I'll take a crash. So this, when you're explaining, this is how you get the wobble, isn't it?
That's
so there's
right.
like a little pyramid top and bottom, and when they sit together,
Get the physical movement, yep.
And it looks so much better as well.
Yes.
Looks like a symbol.
And the other
That's
thing,
it, isn't it?
the other thing I will add, so obviously this is 20 years old, and John just whacked them. None of these clamps moved. None of the drums drooped. It still literally does the job.
Well, when I was talking about durability earlier, it's not just durability of the cymbals and the pads, it's about the sturdiness of the clamps and stuff as well, because, you know, there are some products out there, you know, and I'm not just necessarily talking about drums, I could be talking about a keyboard stand, for example, or something, which are made at a price point, basically. And perhaps when you go to tighten a clamp or something on a stand or something like that, it'll grip, but you find yourself wanting to tighten more and more to get firmer grip, and that's when maybe eventually you can over tighten, the materials can crack or split or break and that kind of stuff. And that becomes really frustrating because the thing that you bought it for, it can no longer do. And particularly for a drummer, if you're hitting something and that is moving whilst you're playing it, there's nothing more infuriating. And actually can really kind of put you off your playing and stop your playing from progressing. So things like the gripping force of the clamps and the durability of those things actually become really important to the product. And again, that's something that we focus in at Roland. That's part of V-Drums.
So we just put the cymbal on. First thing John did was tighten how much he wanted it to wobble. So that's it in a nutshell, isn't it? Being tailored to each drummer. So same sound or switch the kit up. Let's play some more.
Let's go to kit number 1. The old out of the box.
That was just a little tester of what it can do. Obviously, the mesh is being played by two hands. Two hands differ from every drummer, but the velocity structure, shall we say, in the dynamics is all variable, isn't it? So let's discuss that, because obviously that was the new part of the COSM, wasn't it, in how you model it and how you change it. So
well, we were talking earlier on about how we sample drums and we sample them across different velocity layers, so that when you play an electronic version of an acoustic instrument, you are getting a transition between the tones when you play lighter and when you play harder. It's just like when you go to play a crash cymbal, for example. If you hit it very, very lightly, you'll get a sizzle. You won't get a crash sound. You'll get a light, nice sizzle, and then as you start to play it more and more and more, you get more and more of the cymbal reacting to your inputting. It swells, the sound, crescendos, and then in the end you can even get a sound which will really take your face off when you play it really hard. So we've got different velocity layers in the TD10, but one of the questions I get sometimes from people is, the TD10 can still sound really great, a TD6 can sound really great, a TD12 can sound really great. What's the reason to upgrade? And I think John can probably show us in a second. It's not just about the tone. The tone of the drums, actually, this still sounds like quite a good kit when you play the tones, even though the sounds have really moved on. But it's about that playability. It's about the behavioural reaction to your inputting. So if you go to play an acoustic kit, remember I made the point earlier, if you're a really, really good drummer, you can put in incredible ghost notes, incredible technique, and you'll get something back from the acoustic drums. Well, you want the electronic version, the virtual version, the V-Drums, to be able to do the same thing. And that was kind of a limitation of the technology at the time in the TD10. So John, maybe you can play us something like a buzz roll, and then maybe build that up to, from a light velocity to a harder hit, and we'll hear some of the transition between those sounds.
Absolutely.
Bearing in mind this is 20 years old, so this was groundbreaking, and if it sounds a bit crunchy now, that's because we're used to things that are better.
Which we will show you.
We'll get to.
It's very obvious jumps in dynamic. And you can hear the odd cross stick as well. Lots of machine gunning. Yeah, it's really obvious the levels of velocity that are in there.
And just to talk about the machine gunning there that you mentioned, John, basically machine gunning is a term we use for a repetitive sound. So obviously if you're going to play an acoustic drum and you're doing a buzz roll, double stroke roll, the waveform that you would get if you recorded it and looked at it on a computer screen on a DAW, you'd expect the waveform to be a little bit up and down, a little bit bouncy, because there's no way as a drummer you can get every single hit to be identical velocity. You're getting lighter and heavier hits with an acceptable range, so your waveform is doing that. With machine gunning, it means that even though your technique as a drummer, you're playing the same technique you play on an acoustic drum, the reaction is that you get two notes which sound identical. So you get a da 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 da, da, a repetitive shot, we call it, and we call that machine gunning. It's a term that's used a lot. And again, that's one of the limitations of the technology of the time in 1997, is that the tone of the actual instrument sounds great, but we're getting some steps in those velocity layers, and we're the different velocities of the instrument, and we're getting some repetitive shots.
So let's jump forward. This is the TD10, and to Roland's fantastic maths, they jump about with all their numbers and all the time. So sort of between this and then the next flagship model, which was the TD20, there was a 6, a 3, 8 was after?
Yep.
8, so 8 as well. So there was various different models, different price points. That was the whole range. But then you jump, TD20 was the flagship model in the early 2000s, 2004?
That's right, yeah, it was. And then we also had the TD20X, which was the update to the original TD20 in 2009.
With a silver module.
With a silver module, so that's right.
Different again.
That's
so
right.
There was various numbers. The technology changed a little bit. Hardware changed, but was fairly similar. Rubber-rimmed, mesh-topped pads. Then we jumped, what was the next? The next one obviously was TD30, so
that's right.
that jumped up. I've got one here.
You've got it there.
I've snuck it in. So looks fairly similar with your up and down dials, and it's fairly similar to that module. But this had a new technology in it. So this was groundbreaking in every single possibility of it. This was groundbreaking from a module point of view, wasn't it? So
that's right.
What made this different?
Well, essentially, even though the instruments moved on, TD9 was far superior to TD8, for example, or even something like the TD12 was a big step forward for the old TD8 generation, and TD20 was a big step forward from the original 10. The 30 was different, and so is the TD11 and the TD15 we launched at the same time. They all came out in 2012 because it's got a technology inside called Supernatural. So Supernatural is another technology a bit like we had with COSM. Remember I mentioned COSM earlier was an algorithm that we have, a technology which allows you to change the sound virtually of an electronic instrument just like you would in the real world. Well, if that's all about changing the materials to change the sound, Supernatural is all about behavioural reaction. So it's about making sure that when you go to play that snare, or you go to play that ride or play that crash, the reaction that you get back is as true to life as possible. So what John was just showing there, where you were playing and getting some jumps and some obvious steps between the velocity layers and some machine gunning, Supernatural was a technology which takes in the behavioural reaction from the pads, processes it in super fast time inside the module, and then outputs the sound, and it just smooths out any of those transitions in velocity layers and any of the machine gunning effect.
Another good example of this, which was the hi-hat, but we kind of missed that in the step before. When was that? 2004, 2006 or something? Was a two-piece up and down hi-hat. So
2004, I think.
On this, there was more steps in between open and close. So if you press really tight and you were doing like a little jazz thing, you could sort of really press firm, or you can leave it sloshy. There's actually more steps even between open and closing the hi-hat in this, wasn't there?
That's right. Well, it's essentially the VH13s, those cymbals, which we still make today on our flagship kit now, they are capable of picking up between open and closed 127 vertical positions, 127 MIDI notes, if you like. That's not equal to the number of sample layers, but what it does mean is that the transition between open and closed is super, super fine. And again, it's all about true to life reaction. It's about, if you want to play an acoustic hi-hat and you want just a tiny little bit of sizzle, for example, or you want some splash technique and things like that, it's possible on the VH13s because of that.
And the other top tip with that, which I tell all customers, you can only use the Roland hi-hat clutch, because we've had people go, I'm using my Tama or a Gibraltar clutch and it hasn't got the little point at the bottom, so it's just always open.
That's right. Use the ones that come in the box.
So use the ones that come in the box, the beta and the clutch. This obviously was the flagship, and then you had other kits around it, but also with the Supernatural was how you could change the sounds, wasn't it? So when you were these you could change the sounds on a TD10 and edit it a little bit. You took it a step further with this, didn't you? So mic position and things like that. That's all built in here. This all almost become a little mini studio with your drum kit, and you become a producer as much as you do a drummer. So how did that develop with this as well? Obviously with your artists and R&D and things. So how did this become that step forward as well?
Well, definitely between the TD10 generation and TD30 generation, there was an evolution which you'll see transition from the 10 to the 20, 20X and then 30 through the V-Edit system. So we added more and more parameters inside V-Edit to be able to change. And what you were talking about there, about being able to change things like the mic position, etc., is possible now by the time you get to TD30. But also you can control more of the ambient environment again, so you could change your overhead mics in the room, you could change the position of those mics and how far apart they are and things like that, for example. So the ambient control in the TD30 was a real big step forward, and that's part of the V-Edit system as well.
The other thing that was a big step forward and has now become modern was this one, wasn't it? Firmware updates, whether you wanted to put a USB stick in with some backing tracks in, literally that for all things, whether it's phones, laptops, whatever, that has become the standard now. But this was the first kit to have it on, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as you mentioned earlier, you used to have to buy a pack and physically
take your module apart.
Into the previous module. Whereas now, you'll see software updates available from our product pages, and you can just put those on USB and put them in and update the software. And you can do that with even products like TD11, the previous TD15, SPDSX, TD25. All of those products you can update now the firmware simply by putting in a USB.
But this is where it started.
Absolutely.
So where TD30 we're on now, what year was TD30?
2012, NAMM, Winter NAMM show, 2012 we launched the TD30.
So we jumped into this being the flagship. There's no connection between the numbers, as I've said. So we roll from this to that. So let's pull it up.
The new lad in town. The
and
TD50.
if you look, put it beside, fairly similar.
Yeah.
Probably the cool thing we didn't say from that module is plastic, where these are metal skins, so these are quite cool.
Yeah.
But look-wise, fairly similar on all three, and there's 20 years of difference. But user interface and everything, you can jump from one to the other. So
yeah, absolutely.
Put this one down.
Some people have asked, why not go for a big change? There was an opportunity to change big in the TD50. Why did we keep it kind of similar to previous generations? For a couple of reasons, really. One is it's because if somebody is upgrading, if you completely change the way that something is laid out, it means that you have to relearn the whole thing again. So there's a degree of familiarity by keeping a similar style of layout between them. The other thing is it's tried and tested. We know that these are very roadworthy. They're super tough because of the things like the metal casing and the fascias and things as well. This is an expensive piece of equipment. It's an expensive musical instrument, and I call it a music instrument because it is every bit as much as an acoustic instrument, with what it can do. You need your investment to last, to be durable, and you want it to feel like great quality as well. So that's why it's chunky, it's solid, it's heavy, it's made of metal, for all those reasons, basically.
So when people say, why didn't you do a big upgrade or a big difference? You can change the lights on these. What more do you want?
Yeah, I love that feature actually. I think that's really, really cool. We'll show it later, yeah.
So with the TD50 come another technological jump forward. So obviously that's your flagship. It's a current flagship actually. We've now jumped through a few decades. What made this one different? Why would someone go, oh, it's just another V drum? It isn't. This one is special. And to be honest, this is probably a bigger jump than the TD30 was. It is. It's the next step, but let's explain. What makes this a big step forward?
Well, first of all, it's the sounds inside. I talked earlier on about all of our sounds come from acoustic samples. They always start out that way. And when we made the sounds for the TD50, we started again from scratch. There's no sounds borrowed previously from other generations of E-drums like TD30 or TD20. So, for example, TD30, some of the sounds migrated from the TD20.
Which come from that anyway.
Yeah, and there was some new sounds, absolutely, and there's some new sounds in the TD30, but this is all completely from the ground up new sounds inside the 50. When we sample those, we sample them in the highest possible quality, and we sample them in very professional studios in various different locations in the world, and we always sample them with very competent professional drummers as well, who are capable of playing 2 different hits that move slightly between maybe velocity, so one hit is slightly heavier than the other, but without such a big jump between them. That's very, very important. So we work with incredibly professional people. So the sounds that you'll find in the TD50 are brand new, and there's less of them than in the TD50. Than in the TD30. There's less sounds in here than the TD30, and that's because we've gone for quality over quantity. And for example, if you hear a ride or a crash cymbal in here and you play it and just let it ring, just hear that sustain, literally you'll hear the sample go on for a long time, because they're really high quality with high headroom kind of sounds that you'll hear inside here. So that's one of the big changes.
If you pass me that, let's talk about the next thing. So hardware-wise, the drums haven't changed that much in the 2 decades.
That's right.
Until we pick these up. So, go on, pick one up.
So
these are the TD50 flagship pads, if you were to buy. These are the 2 main pads, and these are actual digital pads, aren't they? So
yes. People
have called these digital drums for many years, and it's kind of been, really, because they use an analog cable, and you're just getting 2 sounds. Where these are plugged in by USB. So obviously the TD30 had USB in it for updates and things. This actually has USB in it for hardware connection. So let's talk about that. Why are these special then?
Well, I mean, essentially, electronic drums right the way back from like the very late 70s, early 80s, all the way through to TD30 generation, the connection between the pad and the module has always been a TRS stereo jack cable, basically. So you're taking an analog signal and converting it to digital, essentially. And that works absolutely fine, by the way. Obviously, we've had great results.
And has done it for 20 years with these cables.
Absolutely, yeah. And that works just fine. And even the TD50, you'll see on the back there, many of the pads still connect in the same way. But triggering technology has never really moved on in over 30 years. And with the digital snare and digital ride, that's the first time we've ever been able to move that forward. So these use the same kind of sensors that we use inside these pads, which is a piezoelectric sensor, but there's more of them for a start. So whereas you might find in a cymbal or in a tom pad like this, where they're what we call 2-zone, so you get one zone on the rim and another one on the head, so it will pick up that information. This has got a lot more piezoelectric sensors inside than the 2 that you'll find on a stereo or dual zone trigger pad. But it's also a multi-sensing pad as well. That means that it's got the piezoelectric sensor, but it's also got another sensor, electrostatic sensor, and that's the same kind of technology you'll get in your smartphone when you go to swipe the screen, and it picks up where your finger is via static electricity, and you can swipe on the phone. It's the same technology as that. So by having a USB connection to the module, and you'll see that just here, obviously this is a short cable, it goes into an extension lead. You can take both types of signal, and also you can pull in all of the sensors that are in the pad and send that information directly to the module. And that allows us to do, with these instruments, 2 really cool things, which I think once we set the kit up later on, we'll be able to show you what those things are.
One other good thing about this is 18-inch, so if you play an 18-inch ride on your acoustic kit, that's probably quite small. But for an electronic kit, this is super big as a ride. But even better than that is it's really light compared to the other CYs. So it wobbles and just reacts from your stick very realistically, doesn't it? These 2 components, obviously the module does most of the work, but these 2 pieces of hardware, you can feel the difference. So we get people coming to the store go, really, how much is it? Why? And all I need to say is play the ride, play the snare, play whatever style, play whatever you usually play on your kit, and just feel it and see it. Being able to play really gentle, light swing on this and pulling those notes out, or even on that, being able to play proper cross stick or to do the Bernard Purdie shuffle, you can do that on there properly and it works. So from a hardware point of view, this was the next step up. And it's all because these are digital, these are actual electronic digital pads.
Absolutely, it's really moving that triggering technology forward. And there's the physical changes as well, like you mentioned, the fact that it's bigger. This is now a 14-inch snare rather than the previous Flagship was 12. It's a stainless steel shell. That's a real metal shell. It doesn't do anything for the triggering, but it does affect the look, of course the weight, but it also affects the feel, perhaps, just the stick feel of the pad itself. When you play it, you're now hitting a more solid shell, and you're bound to feel that in the action and the feedback that you get through the stick.
Also different head.
Exactly, I was just about to say it's a 3-ply head rather than a 2-ply head now. So what we've got here is we've got the conventional 2-ply head, which 2 plies are there, and on the inside there's a free floating, not fixed disc layer, and it's not fixed so that the 2 layers can move over that middle layer basically. And what that does is it provides a lot more resistance on the snare. Obviously as you go up in size of the diameter of the shell, then you need more resistance underneath the stick to compensate for the kind of deformation or the almost the trampoline effect, if you like, that you might get as you increase the size of the shell. And that's why we use a 3-ply only on this drum. You don't need that on a 10-inch pad or even a 12-inch pad, but you do need it on a 14. So the PD140 DS digital snare uses a 3-ply mesh head.
Talking about digital, flip it up. There's a button on it. What does the button do?
Interesting.
This is a question we get asked in the store. So
yeah, it's called a function button. Because these pads are digital, they actually use firmware themselves. So it's not just firmware inside the module now. There is firmware for the pads as well. And the customer doesn't need to do anything with this when buying it, from the box. When they get it home, they don't need to do anything. But in the future, there might be firmware updates available for the pad, and you can literally connect the pad to your computer, download the updater file, and using the function button you can physically update the pad as well. It's future-proofing the product.
To make it another 20 years.
Absolutely.
One other thing that was built into this, from a gigging point of view, and something that I learnt from Michael Shack when he was here, so we'll put that video in below. It's a great video. This, from a live point of view, has a whole routing mixing desk in it and XLR balanced out. So for someone who genuinely is gigging with it or using it, whether you've got a hybrid rig or just using an acoustic, using an electronic kit, you can have your personal monitors or whatever. You can literally route this as if it was a mixer with your acoustic and your mics all through this. So it's another step where the 30 might have been a producer step. This is for a live musician, another step forward, isn't it? Just more features in the same box. Absolutely.
So as you said, balanced outputs on the back. You've got an XLR stereo out, but you've also got balanced jack outputs as well for the individual outs. But within the 50, and you could do this in the 30 to a degree, but
this takes it a step further.
It does.
Yeah.
You can route individual pads to whichever output you want. You can send, for example, your toms as individuals, or you could say I want all toms to be through 2 outputs as a stereo set, for example. You could do that with your crashes or whatever. You can even send things like ambience separately to the drums, so you could have a real dry sound from your drums, and you could send ambience or effects through separate channels through the mixer and the outputs. You could send click through the outputs as well if you wanted to, or through the headphones only, so you can route it wherever you need to. Basically, for stage use and recording use, you can send audio to where you need it to go.
And a great example is that we sell kits to all sorts of different scenarios. A friend of ours bought, or a friend of mine, but shops with us, bought a 50, uses it in a theatre pit, and he uses the floor toms as all his percussion, hence why mine's probably got timbales on. because he literally just routes his floor toms as a separate feed. Because he, rather than having, he's done all sorts of different theatre shows. He's done lots of different ones where you'd be in a percussion pit and then you'd be in the orchestral pit, and there are different setups. He's trying to condense his rig, so he literally uses his floor toms as a separate rig and routes it in a different way, all on one instrument. So yeah, for people that genuinely need the functions and will use them, there's more in here.
You mentioned as well earlier on about using it in a hybrid way. So what we call hybrid is mixing electronic drums with acoustic drums together. Somebody might just want to take 1 or 2 pads and have them in their setup, but additionally might also want to put a trigger on the acoustic drum to trigger a secondary sound, as well as the acoustic sound, having another sound from the module as well. So it's possible with this because all the pad inputs are done on jack or digital in some cases. It's possible with those to use it in a hybrid way. With the TD50, we also allow samples to be loaded into the module. That's a big step forward. We never allowed it before. And the reason we didn't allow it before was because a sample is a one shot, it's one sound. Doesn't matter whether you hit the pad light or hard, it's always going to be the same sound. It's just going to be played lighter or quieter. Obviously, virtual drums, V drums, the concept is if you're going to play a crash, you want it to swell, you want the full velocity, layers and experience to be representative of an acoustic instrument, and you wouldn't get that with a one-dimensional, one-shot sound. So why did we allow it in the TD50? It's because a lot of people will use the TD50 in a hybrid capacity. That's a growing trend that we see, and it's been happening on the live stage in the professional world for quite a long time, but we're seeing it more and more. So by being able to load a sample into the TD50, you can then assign it to any pad or any trigger input if you want to, and just trigger that one-shot sound. So if you want your kick or your snare sound from the album, you can trigger it with the TD50. But there's also a function, which I hope we might show a bit later, where you can also take the internal sounds, which are, of course, multi-layered, multi-dimensional, and add a sample underneath it and trigger the two together, and the results of that are just absolutely spectacular.
And that goes full circle to 2 decades ago or longer with the TD7. So you could stack on that.
Yes, you could.
So
yeah, four different samples at the same time, or 4 different internal waves at the same time, yes.
So even now, Roland always looking back as well as forward and combining as many functionalities into their products just to make sure they're the step ahead.
Yes.
That's basically the whole evolution of V-drums and why they're as good as they are, and why Roland are forever at the forefront of pushing them forward. So everything from that, from 1992 to this, is the steps forwards and all the links in between. So check it out. The TD50 and all the Roland products are very good. So this is Drum Addicts. This has been Jules and John, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
Sorted.
Cheers at the end. Cheers.
Cheers.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the Andertons drum channel. Hope you enjoyed it. But if you're a guitar player or a bass player, you play keyboards, or you're into music technology, we've got other YouTube channels that you might be interested in, and I'll put links to those in the description below. Anyway, if you want to find out more about the products we showed in this video, please click up here. If you'd like to watch another video from the drum channel, please click over here. If you'd like to buy a t-shirt like this one, or in lots of other colors, click down here. And finally, if you'd like to subscribe to the Andertons drum channel, please click down here. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.